Wow, and we're live. That was a lot faster than it usually happens. All right, hello everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome to the January Patrons Hangouts. I try to host one or two of these streams every month just to say thank you to all those that support my channel financially via Patreon, Subscribestar, or Bitbacker, or whatever other methods may be available. I know we do have one who donates through BitChute and their PayPal system. So the way this works, pretty much right now, I've been joined by two of my patrons, longest time patrons I've had, Pipsqueak and Nightshift 10,000. We can discuss whatever's on their minds, but I will also be keeping an eye on the chat. So if there's anything anyone wants to talk about, we talk about serious stuff. We talk about, entertainment-related stuff. Nothing is off limits on these Patron Hangout streams. JC Armitage, hello to you. He's actually been one of our most loyal stream people to come by on the stream between my Pokemon streams on my gaming channel in here. So, Pipsqueak, Nightshift, go ahead and say hi, and we'll jump right into this.
Hello.
Yep. Hello, Pipsqueak, coming in here from Australia. Nightshift.
Hey, what's up?
Not much, and I see Neil Stone has already joined us in the chat. So anyways, just to kick things off, I wanted to mention to all our viewers, I know Today with 2 Cents, the current events video series that I did once a week that later became a live stream that kind of fizzled into nothing. It is coming back. I'm working on revamping it. It's going to be as a podcast as opposed to a regular video, but I do want to keep up with current events. And I actually have recently, thanks to one of my patrons who wished to remain anonymous, but really upped his donation to try to help me bring that back. So thank you to him. Current events. I know I'm a little late to the party at this one because the whole Iran thing has kind of fallen out of the news, but I did have some thoughts on that I wanted to talk about. So as I'm sure everyone is aware, a couple weeks ago, Donald Trump had Qasem Soleimani, a leading Iranian general, killed via a surgical drone strike, killed him and about 5 of his men. The Iranian government responded by launching Tomahawk cruise missiles into Iraq, which hit several military sites, but did not kill any U.S. troops. And the running rumor is that the Iranian government basically called the Iraqi government beforehand, said, yeah, we're doing this. We need to convince our people that we're responding, but we don't really want conflict, so we're going to try our hardest not to kill anybody. And afterwards, it just kind of fizzled out of the media. And of course, the whole discussion that came up was, Donald Trump is a warmonger. He's just trying to start conflict where there shouldn't be any. Interestingly enough, considering drone strikes were really President Obama's MO, and after everything he did in Libya. And people like Bernie Sanders were saying, we don't need to go to war. There were others. There are other figures saying, like, Ben Shapiro, who would talk about how evil the Iranian government is, how they sponsor terrorism worldwide, and how this was an important strategic attack done by Donald Trump. And of course, I don't claim to be an expert. I don't claim to have all the facts. I'd just like to draw attention to a couple of things that none of the major media outlets really talk about, and I think there's a reason for that. Now, when it comes to the issue of Iran, I have been clear in the past on many of these streams. I'm hearing, just hang on quick. I'm hearing some kind of disturbance in the background.
Yeah.
Is that coming from my mic or is that somebody else?
I don't know. It sounds like you're breaking up.
Okay, not sure. I'll see what I can do about that. All right, I'll try to monkey with my mic a little bit and see what I can do about it. But in any case, so the issue of Iran, obviously the Iranian government, I agree, is a oppressive and evil regime that oppresses its own people and does in fact sponsor terrorism worldwide. However, that applies to quite a number of countries. Saudi Arabia, for example, which the United States is all too eager to claim as a key ally in the Middle East, also sponsors terrorism, also oppresses its people and commits numerous human rights violations. As for terrorism, if you look at the continent of Africa, there are hundreds of terrorist groups currently committing atrocities. So obviously the United States is not interested in hunting down and killing every terrorist that exists, and nor could it. But it's just interesting to point out that since there is so much terrorism going on worldwide, if and when the U.S. does take military action, you got to ask the explanation that we need to take action to protect freedom and democracy worldwide is not a good enough reason to explain why they're doing anything. You could say, well, it's to protect U.S. citizens and to protect our national borders. But at the same time, I seriously doubt the Iranian government is stupid enough to try and attack United States citizens on United States soil. They know that would respond, the U.S. would respond appropriately. And whether or not the U.S. could successfully occupy Iran, I think the Iranians know that when push comes to shove, they don't have a chance going up against the Iranian military, against the United States military. So when the U.S. takes any kind of military action, the question to ask is, why are they really doing this? And it's at the end of the day, it's going to come back to somebody important stands to make money by taking that action, and that action, the action is necessary as opposed to some sort of economic sanction or some other diplomatic solution. Now, we talked about this in the past, but it's been a while, so I'll just remind everybody what really props up the United States dollar, right? The monetary system right now is the petrodollar system that has been in place since the early 1970s. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made a deal with the King of Saudi Arabia that after Nixon put an end to the Bretton Woods system and the U.S. was formally severed from any formal connection with gold for backing, the Saudi Arabians basically agreed, we're only going to sell oil in U.S. dollars. We will pressure all other OPEC nations to do the same. And as a result, we received what's called the international petrodollar system. That is, every country in the world, if they want to buy petroleum, must use U.S. dollars to do so. As a result, every country in the world uses the U.S. dollar as its reserve currency, and keeps a large number of dollars on hand, simply because petroleum being such a necessary commodity in the world economy today, if you don't have dollars, you're not going to be able to buy and sell the petroleum that you need, and that keeps the international demand for dollars high, so that even though the Fed keeps printing hundreds of billions of dollars, as they've been doing just over the past couple of months to prop up the economy, the dollar hasn't collapsed yet because of the international demand. Now, several countries have tried to get rid of the petrodollar. Saddam Hussein started trading oil in euros, and very shortly thereafter, the United States invaded and toppled his government. Gaddafi in Libya was attempting to do something similar, and under the Obama administration, the United States military had Gaddafi killed and his government toppled. Now, Libya is in complete shambles, but they are once again trading oil in dollars, and which then brings us to the country of Iran. So ever since '79, when the Shah of Iran was overthrown, the Ayatollah is certainly no friend of the United States, but one way or another, the United States does need to keep Iran trading oil in dollars. And Iran, given all the economic sanctions that the United States has put against them, has a vested interest in finding some kind of alternative currency or alternative way of doing business that avoids the U.S. dollar, so that they can expand their own interests, as other countries have tried to do. So, can I say specifically why Donald Trump had Soleimani killed? No, I'm not in possession of all the facts, but I would say I have a strong hunch it has to do with the United States keeping pressure on Iran to continue holding up the petrodollar system. And that is, despite all the explanations here in the mainstream media, that is the one thing nobody seems to be talking about. So I thought it was worth a mention.
Mm-hmm.
Because if anybody else had anything to add, by all means, please do. But I'll get off my soapbox for a minute.
That pretty much sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh boy.
Neil Stone in the comments section mentions that China is trying something similar. He is correct. The Chinese yuan, I know, I believe it is the city of Shanghai. I'm not positive about that, so someone can fact check me. But they have begun trading oil in yuans in Shanghai. Now, obviously, given the difference between a country like China and a country like Iran or a country like Iraq, I don't believe military invasion is going to be a feasible course of action in that end for the United States there. But also notice in the media all the talk that's been going on about Trump and his trade deal with China. You can bet that has Chinese actions on that front has something to do with that as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, like I said, ran my mouth there for quite a bit. But if there's anything anyone wants to talk about, by all means, or if anybody in the chat, there's something that someone wants us to bring up, it can be serious, but doesn't have to be. This is for y'all. So,
someone in the chat mentions that he says that the rebels who overthrew the Shah and the Iranian Revolution were backed by the US. That's not actually true. The Shah was installed by the US. The rebels that overthrew him was a mix of Islamic extremists and communist sympathizers stirred up by the KGB sending agents to Iran because the Soviet Union wanted to control Iran and quite a significant amount of oil deposits in that region. But it turns out that Islamic extremists don't like sharing power. Who knew, right? I thought they learned this lesson with Stalin and Lenin.
Actually, I think what he's thinking about is the fact that the United States backed Iraq during the Iraq-Iranian War in the 1980s and 70s, and that the United States was backing Iraq, and the Russians were still kind of backing the Iranians, but not as much since the overthrow of the Shah. But yes, back then we absolutely loved Saddam Hussein for some reason, and we were backing up Iraq. In that regard, we were training their troops and we were arming them up, and I think that's kind of where the wires got crossed.
Mm-hmm. Just a brief, and again, I'm not an expert, so if I mess anything up here, anyone's free to correct me on the specifics. But as far as the history of the government of Iran, post World War I, in either the 20s or 30s, the date escapes me, but the government of Iran was actually overthrown by a joint American and British intelligence operation that installed the Shah of Iran into power. The Shah was in power until 79 and was effectively a puppet of the United States. The combined Marxist Islamic extremist revolution in 1979 displaced the Shah, and that is the current government of Iran has been in power since 79, and that is the one that is no longer backed by the United States, but that we are currently pressuring to maintain the petrodollar system.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Neil Stone asks,
if you want a more complete history of U.S. intervention in that area, Reason TV did Intervention, a Success Story, which is very sarcastic, but it is a very good, quick summary of the history of all the U.S. interventions in that area.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And of course, the main thing to understand, anytime the United States tells you, or anytime any country for that matter says they're invading another country for the sake of the freedom and independence of those people, or because of human rights violations that are taking place in that country, it's a bunch of crap. If any of these governments really cared about that stuff, there are a lot more places in the world they'd be going to. If somebody's initiating military intervention in a country, it's because someone somewhere stands to make a lot of money because of it.
Oh yeah.
Call me a cynic, but that's the way the world works. It's the way states work. Neil Stone asks, are any of you going to the Virginia gun control protest? I personally will not be. Pipsqueak, I'm guessing you're not making the flight from Australia. That might shift.
No.
No.
I live about 2,000 miles away from Virginia, so that's not gonna happen.
I will say on that issue, Liberty Doll, who I've had on my channel before, she's been making videos about those that are pretty good covering that issue. I am, honestly, it's nice to hear that a lot of the police departments and National Guardsmen in Virginia have basically said these gun control measures Virginia is passing are unconstitutional. We will not enforce them, which is good for the time being. But since they're on the books, I feel like it's only a matter of time. They don't really have to enforce them now. They just need to wait till this all blows over and, 10, 20 years down the road when they've got new cops, new National Guardsmen who have been fully indoctrinated by state propaganda from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's now that the laws were put on the books 20 years ago, it'll be just a simple matter of enforcing them after this is all blown over. So, I mean, good on those cops and National Guardsmen who say they won't do it now, but so long as they remain on the books, it'll just be a looming threat in the future.
Well, I also heard that the Virginia state government has declared like a state of emergency because of threats that the different militia groups that are there's like different militia groups that are threatening to storm the Capitol or something like that.
They
Okay.
announced
Has anyone heard about
state of
that?
emergency like immediately after this rally was organized. So I think they're trying to paint the rally as storming the Capitol, which is complete BS.
It's just trying to create another justification for increasingly militarizing the police and increasing their patrols, finding ways to enforce these laws. I say all the people of Virginia really need to do is say, "Hey, you want my guns? Come and get them," and
Yeah.
and see what happens as cops start
Yeah,
going door to door to take people's guns.
Virginia's governor declares a state of emergency after people decide to exercise both their First and Second Amendment rights simultaneously. That's what that actually means.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Neil Stone says, hopefully in 20 years we will be more libertarian. Well, the federal government will not be. The state government of Virginia, I don't know. But we'll see what happens to the federal government after this, after the looming economic collapse.
Yeah. Hopefully the federal government and hopefully most governments by then will be gone.
Mm-hmm. Another thing mainstream media isn't telling you is, I mentioned this briefly with talking about Iran, but the Fed has, I don't, I'm going to look up the exact number. The amount of cash the Fed's been pumping into the economy is approaching the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars at this point.
Yeah, collapse.
To all those watching, is my voice echoing or how's the mic doing? Because I tried to adjust it a little bit.
Your mic's fine.
My mic's fine? Okay.
Yeah.
According to the most recent reports on the Wall Street Journal, the Fed added $52.6 billion to markets over the past...
God.
Yeah, $52.6 billion just this past Friday. So, yeah, when it's injecting amounts of money that large over such short periods of time, you know the economy is teetering on the brink. They're doing everything they can to push it off. They can't stop it. They might, and I don't presume to say how long they can push it off, but they're only guaranteeing it's going to be that much worse when it finally collapses.
Yep.
Litigious Society, Manny K. Built, hello to you. Tony Skaggs says, see you, guys. God bless you. Thank you. God bless you as well, Tony. Neil Stone says, I have been getting into debates with commies and they keep claiming that China is capitalist, but I keep insisting it is communist. Opinions? Well, I'll go ahead. I do have opinions on that. I'll go ahead and put your comments up here. I would say this: China is the Communist Party that was started by Mao Zedong remains in power. Xi Jinping, if I am not mistaken, just declared himself dictator for life this past week. So make no mistake, China is communist. Now, where it gets a little tricky, unlike the Soviet Union, the Chinese basically figured out that communism and economic central planning doesn't work. And in that regard, they greatly released, starting in 80s and 90s, they greatly released the stranglehold they had on the economy. And as a result, the Chinese economy flourished quite a bit. Now, the fact that they got fiscally more libertarian does not mean they are not a communist government. They are still an authoritarian government. They still have total gun control, complete monitoring power to monitor their citizens through internet and phone communications. They have a sort of social credit system that determines whether or not you're considered a reliable witness in court based on, whether or not you say good things about the government or whether or not you get speeding tickets or saying bad things about the government online. They are an authoritarian government that is smart enough to allow some free market practices, but I don't think it's appropriate to say China is capitalist or China is socialist. China is authoritarian. That pretty much sums it up.
Well, that's just like China is still mostly communist, where the free markets in China, where markets are, just markets in general in China is mainly restricted to special economic zones and the like, which is what they're trying to turn Hong Kong into, and why Hong Kong is just completely free in the first place is when Hong Kong was originally slated to be handed back to China, China wanted to go full communism, and almost every single business in there decided, basically threatened capital flight, and China went, oh shit, well, we don't want to lose that, and so they made the special economic zones rule for Hong Kong. But a lot of the Chinese, because remember, China is a huge country, and you can't base a judgment on what their economy is like simply by looking at the few relatively free cities that we can see. It's still a very communist country, and even where markets are, I would be more inclined to say it's less of a free market and more like a kind of Orwellian capitalism.
I think that's an appropriate way to put it. International on the international front too. We talk about the trade war that exists between the United States and China. Obviously, trade wars are not capitalist in that any effort to restrict free trade between individuals in individual businesses, be they in separate countries, is inherently anti-free market. Jacket Man says it's government-run capitalism in China. That's another way to put it. And I think Pipsqueak's most appropriate point there is the fact that China is such a large country, and they like Hong Kong. From an economic perspective, Hong Kong has basically been considered a separate country up to this point. But now that the Chinese are trying to crack down full control, the people of Hong Kong are rioting and protesting.
That was weird.
Okay. Well, do you have a problem, Night Shift? Or?
It was like I got kicked or something.
Okay, not sure. We usually have that happen at least once or twice on these streams. Yeah. StreamYard, still not a perfect system. SL says that from what I understand, the Chinese government is controlled by the Communist Party, but the system they impose is basically fascism. I think that's a fair way of putting it as well. As I said, the government that is in charge is the same Communist Party of Mao Zedong. The Chinese have simply been smart enough to free up their markets in certain places, which has led to increased prosperity to the Chinese people in some regards, but it is not a free market country by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, another point to bring up is there is no country right now that has a truly free market. Every market in the world is heavily restricted to more or less degrees by the government. It's really a question of who has the freest market right now, which interestingly enough, for a long time has been Hong Kong, but that's starting to change. Albedo says, you heard about Germany being on the brink of a recession. Their economic growth is at an all-time low. I'd say the world is really on the brink of an economic recession right now, and I am honestly not sure what the final trigger is going to be. I suspect it will come from the United States, although it could be Europe or somewhere else. But when now that the world economies are so intricately intertwined, as we saw in 2008, when the next recession comes, it will be a worldwide recession. There's no getting out of it. Joshua says it's anti-free market to tolerate goods from an economy that uses slave labor from concentration camps. I take it you're referring to China?
I would think so. They definitely use work camps there.
Yeah. Well, what I would say in that regard is yes. If people are being forced against their will to create products, that's slavery, and it's not a free market. Now, the trading of those products after the fact may or may not take place in a voluntary fashion, but yes, the use of slave labor to create products, if those people are not voluntarily participating, is not free market.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on from there. I guess I'll keep an eye on the chat here if there's anything anyone wants to talk about. But on a lighter note, as usual, we always talk about, world events, serious stuff, and then just totally not serious stuff. I recently discovered that the Marvel Studios is planning on making a movie about Michael Morbius. I know that's not exactly new news, but I just found out about it this week. So I wanted to bring that up. I know the character Michael Morbius because when I was a kid, the Spider-Man, the animated series, had him mostly as a villain, but somewhat of an anti-hero in some regards. Is there anybody here who's more familiar with exactly where he fits in?
I know he. Okay, that's kind of where I know him from too. I wasn't really I wasn't really a big fan of his graphic novels, or his appearances in like the Spider-Man graphic novels and other graphic novels. I know that he aligned up with Blade in the graphic novels and in the animated series too. But that's about as much as I know, and I would love to see. I'm like you. I would love to see a Blade revamping, but there's not much I know about Michael Morbius except for that he is a vampire, and that I think him and what's her name, the blonde one, Felicia Hardy, got together. Yeah,
that was together in the Spider-Man the animated series. He was her love interest for a long time. But what's unique about Michael Morbius is, unlike all the other vampires, he became a vampire via science, not like supernatural vampirism.
Yeah, exactly.
JC Armitage says, "Do you think global depression will lead to World War III?" Depends on what you mean by World War III. If do I think it means that every country in the world will go to war? Not necessarily. What I can say is that in times of economic hardship, if people get desperate enough to start stealing or rebelling against their governments on a mass scale, that certainly can lead to armed conflict. And depending on where the armed conflict takes place, it certainly could lead to a larger scale war. I don't really presume to know how that's going to play out, but short answer, no, I'm not inclined to think it will directly lead to World War III. But hey, you never know. Neil Stone says, "I loved your video on the feminist mom and her daughter. The only problem I have is that since I was a leftist, I know there are multiple forms of feminism, some even being sex positive." I'm aware that there are different expressions of feminism within those that espouse feminism. But what I would say is that the uniting, my point in that video was that the uniting aspect of feminism is that women can never be at fault for anything. Men are responsible for all women's problems, but as you can see, and as that article showed, it ends up being internally incoherent, because when one woman has a problem with something else that another woman does, how do they decide who's right? Since there's no man involved in that case, all they can say is that the only thing they can agree on is that it's somehow the man's fault, even though they can't agree on what they're actually supposed to be doing. So whether feminists call themselves sex positive or sex negative, it still ends up, the ideology inevitably ends up imploding on itself. I don't know if Pipsqueak or Night Shift have anything to add to that.
Not really.
Okay. Jacket Man says, "I have some questions about anarcho-capitalism. Question 1, how do we come to a consensus on whether abortion is aggression or not?" Well, Jacket Man, I would direct you to my video series, Abortion and Libertarianism. I've made 4 videos on the subject. The question is basically this. Isn't it, what is the unborn child? Is it a human being or is it not? And once you answer the question, is it a human being or is it not? Is there any morally relevant distinction between human persons and human so-called non-persons? Or the final question, would abortion, even if hang on, I'm going to start over because I'm using more complicated terminology than I need to. Question 1: is a fetus a human organism? Question 2: is a fetus a human person? Question 3: is abortion in some sense self-defense? You have to answer those 3 questions, and I believe that the answer I believe the answer is yes. From a scientific standpoint, fetus is absolutely a human being. There is no morally relevant difference between a human fetus and a human adult, and you cannot properly, given the nature of sexual reproduction, you cannot adequately categorize abortion as a form of self-defense. So go ahead but as for the arguments, I've already taken a great deal of time to put my argument into those videos. So if you head to my channel homepage, just look at it's one of the main playlists that's down there: abortion, libertarianism. His second question: there are ways to avoid taxes, so in the end, how is it theft? Well, I'm not sure what you mean when you say there are ways to avoid taxes. If you mean people do in fact try to get out of their taxes, then yes, of course, that's true. But if the IRS finds out that you have not been paying taxes, they are going to send men with guns to your doorstep and throw you in prison. So at the end of the day, no, there is no way you can choose to not pay it is not voluntary. They will compel you to do so by force.
No, the fact that you could avoid some taxes, or that, I mean, that you can get away with that for a while, it's just kind of a bonus. But in the end, it's extortion, and they will always come for you if they find out that you're doing it. So, I mean, that is theft, no matter how you push it.
JC Armitage said, just because you can prevent a theft doesn't mean the attempted action is not theft. If a person comes to my front door and tries to break it down only to discover that I have a very effective security system, and suddenly tons of alarms go off, so they run away, never completing the theft, doesn't change the fact that they still tried to rob me. Jacket Man says, question 3: how are we going to defend the nation, especially from a nation like China? Well, the existence of a military or a defensive force, whatever you call it, does not require state taxation. There are already private security companies. There is no reason that military functions could not be privatized, and that smaller private military organizations could not join forces with other smaller military organizations for mutual defense if it became necessary. He says, let me expand on question number 2. We can avoid property taxes by not owning property. You can avoid income taxes by doing under-the-table jobs. Actually, to the latter point, doing under-the-table jobs is illegal as far as the IRS is concerned. If they find out you've been earning money under the table, they can demand that you pay taxes on that income, and will forcibly extract that from you otherwise. Saying we can avoid property taxes by not owning property, that's basically amounts to the argument, well, you can go ahead and leave the country. It doesn't change the fact that you never agreed to pay for the programs that you're being asked to pay for. I've used this example before, but I'll say it again. In my video, taxation is theft and the social contract is BS. Suppose you come home and find that somebody has mowed your lawn and then demands that you pay them for mowing the lawn. If there was no agreement between you and the person who mowed your lawn beforehand, he can't just provide the service to you and demand payment after the fact. That's theft, and it doesn't cease to be theft if he just suddenly pulls out a badge and says, "Actually, I'm from the government lawn mowing agency, and by living in this neighborhood, you've implicitly agreed to allowing me to cut your lawn."
It's very much like the so-called social social contract.
Yeah, that's the argument. The argument made in favor of taxation is typically the social contract, as explained by John Locke and others. They say that by living in a certain territory, and by benefiting from the services that the government provides, you tacitly consent. So even if there's no explicit consent, by living in the area, you tacitly consent to the government's rule by benefiting from the services. Well, if that's the case, then if some guy just comes by and mows my lawn, how is it that I am not required to pay him, even if no matter how good a job he does, even if I've benefited from that, if he doesn't ask me beforehand whether or not he wants me to, if I want him to mow the lawn, then he can't just mow it and demand that I pay him after the fact. Rarte Drawfee says, how is for age of consent morally justified and functions without a state? I would direct you to the video collab I did with Night Shift 10,000 and Mag. I don't believe in age of consent. I believe in rites of passage. Specifically, I believe that one has to demonstrate the capability to consent before they can consent. And in particular, if one is still living with it, if one is still living with and depending on their parents for their livelihood, then they have not yet demonstrated the capacity to function as an adult and cannot consent.
Well, to answer that question a different way, how is enforcing that kind of thing justified, whether it's your rite of passage or age of consent or whatever? It kind of gets to, there's an underlying question of that in why is pedophilia unethical? It's unethical because you can provably cause neurological trauma by subjecting an underage human being to that kind of intimate contact. That's why it's unethical, because you are causing someone damage. And firstly, that you can cause someone neurological damages, and second is you cannot assume inability to consent is an affirmative consent.
Indeed, and as to exactly what point is the line crossed where the person is capable of consenting, well, I'd say there'd have to be evidence to show that the person is capable of consenting. And in particular, if a person is still living with and depending on their parents for their sustenance, then and is not capable of functioning as an adult on their own, then the burden of proof, then a person, the burden, an offender in that case is going to bear a very heavy burden of proof to be able to show that the child was in fact capable of consenting.
Well, I mean, most countries have an age of consent around 16 to 18. That seems to be the general consensus. I mean, you could base it off of a neurological study of maturing children, say, and have scientists go, okay, this is the point, or when the brain is capable of processing X stimulus or whatever, and based off that, or you could base it off rites of passage or whatever. We don't really prescribe a specific, we have to do it this way. It's more a case of this behavior is unethical. What kind of judgments can be made about how to prevent it? It would be entirely up to essentially a free market.
Yes, and rather than an arbitrary line, when you hit this prior to being this age, you cannot consent. After this age, you can consent. Whatever conflicts may arise, each case is going to have to be examined based on the specific facts of that case. Was this person old enough to be able to consent to what you're alleging they consented to? We'll have to examine the evidence and determine that based on a number of factors. It's my personal opinion that of course, the case of child abuse is always the one that comes up. I think one of the biggest factors that is likely to arise is, again, what was the person, the alleged victim in question, still living with their parents and depending on their parents for sustenance, or were they, or had they since moved out and were functioning as an adult, being responsible for their own legal choices? That seems to me to be a pretty significant differentiation between whether you should be considered a child or considered an adult in that circumstance. But I do agree with Pipsqueak. The free market in that regard would provide solutions. Great question here. Jacket Man says, how are poor people going to be able to pay for private education, which is pretty expensive? I would ask you to please consider this question. Why is private education expensive? Private education is expensive because right now the state provides public education for free. Of course, we know it's not really free. The taxpayer is footing the bill, but because there is this nominally free education, demand for private education goes down quite a bit, and as a and as a result, there are private educational institutions end up having to raise their prices to stay in business, given the smaller number of people that are seeking private education. So the answer is, if there was no public education, private education would be cheap. But it's specifically because
There's also the problem of.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on 2 seconds. Make my point.
Okay, but as happens with healthcare, as happens with anything else, when you make something free, demand becomes essentially infinite, and those private institutions that do end up surviving that end up becoming vastly more expensive than they otherwise would be if supply and demand were allowed to function with no public intervention.
There's also the problem that we are getting, we as people are also getting screwed out of massive amounts of income, mainly because of government interventions like taxes and regulations. And Esoteric Entity originally pointed this out, but I actually looked into what he said, and he pointed me in the direction of a website where they literally showed that we are getting screwed out of 75% of our incomes, and that potentially the middle class income could go up, or like the GDP per capita could go up in a stateless, governmentless society from 65,000, where it is now on average, to about 320 to 350,000 per average. And that's just the average. We're not talking about high class budgets. We're not talking about low class budgets. And so, I mean, you have to consider that the poor income, at least in comparison, will also be going up, while prices will on that end be going down. So the poor kind of stop being, they sort of stop being poured away.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how many billion hours per year is spent just doing tax paperwork?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
If you just eliminate tax paperwork and have replace the entire tax code with a completely flat 10% tax, so you eliminate almost all of that tax paperwork that needs to be done, how much more productive would the economy be? This isn't even abolishing any regulations or even abolishing taxation itself. It's just getting rid of this ridiculous. How many friggin' pages is the US tax code? It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's more than 100,000 pages.
It's like 5 billion hours per year, completely and utterly wasted.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the point I was going to make is that John Stossel made a video on public sector unions. It was specifically about a transport union, but public sector unions. And he had a business owner that had a privately owned mass transportation company, and he basically said that he had a major problem with staffing because he'd hire new people, train them up, and then they'd immediately leave to go work in the public mass transportation industry, because the public unions there had risen the wages to ridiculous levels. So private schools sort of have a major problem in they can't afford to pay the staff enough to keep them there without passing that cost on to the consumer, whereas the public schools can pay the teachers whatever the hell they ask for because they're subsidized by the taxpayer.
Exactly. And another thing to think about is the fact that no one spends your money more efficiently than you do. If you think about whatever your net worth is, how much money you have, you decide what is worth it to you. Do you want to get a college degree? Do you want to have more nice meals over the years? Do you want to live in a big house? Do you want to live in a small house? Do you want a nice car? Do you want an average car? Do you want to take public or do you want to ride the bus? Whatever the case may be. However much money you have, you decide how much the things you want are worth to you. In the case of government is taking your money and then arbitrarily deciding how much these various services like public education, how much should public teachers be paid? Well, they want to be paid more like everybody else does, but unlike private customers who eventually a threshold is going to get crossed where they decide, you know what, that is, if you're going to ask for that much money, I don't want your services. The government is bound by no such burden. They can always steal more money to keep increasing the pay. Now, in a truly free market, the issue of education in a truly free market, if there is demand for education, then only those private schools that are able to provide the highest quality education at the lowest possible price are going to be able to survive in the free market. But when and there always will be a demand for education, but when education is made quote unquote free by the government, everybody is entitled to education and will ensure you have it by stealing more money. When given the choice, do I want to pay to send my child to private school, or do I want to send my child to public school for free? Well, it's human nature. Most people are going to pick the free option. There's going to be very few people who are still going to want to pay for public school when that public school option is available. And if there's now a smaller number of people seeking private school education, and as Pipsqueak just pointed out, the private schools, in order to compensate for the amount of business they're losing to the public sector, they have no choice but to raise the tuition to private school, or else they're not going to be able to stay in business, and they're not going to be able to compete to keep teachers in those private schools. They're not going to be able to pay wages that will compete with public teacher wages unless they make it that much more expensive. So that is what, the question was, why is private education so expensive? Government is driving prices up specifically by providing crappy public education. Now, actually, JC Armitage has a great comment here. Because of public education, if you want to go to private school, you're basically paying both of these things despite only using one of them. And that's absolutely right. If you send your child to private school, you're actually paying twice, because your taxes are still going towards public school, but you're also choosing to pay the tuition to go to private school.
Yep.
I owe this line to Shane Killian probably, but he's really not the first person to say it. And that is that no one spends your money as efficiently as you do. You can decide what your money is worth to you, but if somebody else takes your money, they'll always be more cavalier in how they spend it. Or best case scenario, there would be no difference because they would spend it exactly the same as you did.
Uh-huh. Well, it breaks down like this. Is what you want important? If the answer is yes, then it goes down to, is what you want going to violate the rights of others? If yes, then that means it's not important. If not, then would you be willing to pay for whatever you want out of your own pocket without forcing anybody else to pay for it? Yeah, too. And if the answer is yes, then you will more than likely be able to find it in the private sector. Go ahead, Pipsqueak. What were you going to say?
I did want to get to Jack and Man's fifth question here. Let's say I'm digging up uranium in my backyard. This can harm my neighbors. So does this violate the non-aggression principle? As to whether or not it violates the non-aggression principle, I think this is basically the pollution question. If I pollute my neighbor's property, am I violating the non-aggression principle? The answer is yes, if you are in fact polluting your neighbor's property. Now, it gets tricky in that in some of these, like the uranium question, if I'm deliberately housing dangerous materials on my property and the radiation is leaking over into my neighbor's property, and the radiation is there specifically because of actions I take, then yes, I am violating the non-aggression principle. My neighbor would have the right to take me to a private court and adjudicate that matter. But
oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
But that's the issue with pollution. Everyone says, well, what about pollution? You've got the non-aggression principle does not allow you to pollute property that you do not own. But then again, the burden of proof is on the person making the complaint to prove that you are polluting their property. So when it comes to issues like he's smoking a cigarette on his front lawn and the smoke is drifting over onto my property, the burden of proof is going to be on them to prove how the person smoking a cigarette on his property is meaningfully impeding their ability to enjoy their property. In that case, I think they're going to shoulder a very heavy burden of proof to try and show that the neighbor smoking the cigarette is polluting their property. On the other hand, if my neighbor is housing dangerous radioactive materials that are causing radiation to leak over onto my property, yeah, it's going to be pretty easy for him to prove that, and the court will uphold that.
Now, make no mistake, you can actually mine it if you're taking the proper safety precautions. You can't pollute your neighbor's property, but of course, if you find uranium in your backyard and you get all the equipment to mine it properly, then absolutely you can do that. It's just so long as you're not harming others. And
so yeah, that pretty much answers that question. Again, Jacket Man, I would encourage you to look at my anarcho-capitalist playlist. I've already made videos that answer some of these questions, but every now and then it's worth rehashing. I know many people. I've actually, to my surprise, gained a number of subscribers this week, which is a welcome addition because channel growth has been virtually nothing ever since YouTube's new terms of service came in. But heck, if they're finding my channel, then great.
Jacket Man brings up the question of who would enforce currency. Having an enforced currency is kind of the problem we have now. It's like we shouldn't have one single legal tender because, like, the currency will become worthless. The currency kind of already is worthless. Like the US dollar has lost 98% of its value since it's gone off the gold standard. The thing in a free market with currency is that you have multiple competing currencies, which means that there is no incentive to, the example of someone just starting to print money so he can pay for things with paper. If he does that, the currency will inflate to a point that nobody will accept his worthless paper anymore.
Mm-hmm. And I think this gets back to the discussion of most. I think the reason people ask this question is because most people don't realize what money actually is, and they don't understand the difference between money and a currency. Now, money and currency there are a number of factors that make them what they are. They have to be a medium of exchange. They have to be divisible. They have to be fungible. But the main difference between money and currency is that money actually has to be a store of value. There has to be, in some measure or another, it has to be resistant to counterfeiting, and it has to, in order to make more of it, there has to be real labor and resources that are required to make more of it, such that it keeps the supply under control. Currency is not a store of, like paper money that governments, fiat money that governments issue, is not a store of value because they can print as much as they want of it and constantly lower its value. And the only way they get away with this is specifically because of legal tender laws, because they formally declare that if you want any business within our borders, you must accept US dollars, or you must accept British pounds, or you must accept whatever currency we're talking about. You must accept this as payment for debt. So then people have to accept the money regardless of how much the government keeps devaluing it. In a truly free market, a dominant currency or several dominant currencies are going to arise simply because of their utility and how well they fulfill the function of money. And I would, if you're interested, Mike Maloney, there's a YouTube channel called Mike Maloney's Hidden Secrets of Money. He has a series that describes with animated graphics very well the difference between money and currency and why the one has value and the other doesn't.
I would disagree that being used as a medium of exchange is a quality of money. It's not to me, it's not a quality of money, but it's rather a function of money. And being divisible, fungible, and etc. is what makes something useful for that function, which is why it is then accepted as money. Because otherwise it's sort of a circular reason. Like, in order to be money, something has to be a unit of account and medium of exchange, and the only things that are that is money. It's circular reasoning. Sorry.
Okay, and that's a fair distinction. I guess what I'm getting at is you could try to use something like oil as money. Oil certainly has value in its ability.
Oil has the qualities of it's certainly fungible.
Yes.
Oil of a certain quality, oil of a certain known quality, is fungible because it has properties that are testable, so you can verify that this is oil. You can verify it by density, weight, or a number of other chemical things. You can, it's fairly easily transported, so it's portable, it's fungible, it's divisible because it's measured in your milliliters or whatever. You can divide it all the way down to almost nothing, which means you can make change with it. So, but the problem with oil as money is it's not that predictable, and you can synthesize oil, so it's not secure.
Yeah.
And I would disagree about it being portable. I think given it's a liquid, the ability to transport the amounts you would need, I can't imagine a person walking around with a wallet full of oil. So in that regard, it's less useful.
Not for individual use, but certainly a company could potentially barter with an industrial amount of oil in exchange for certain other products. But that would be more. It would be more if it were adopted. I imagine it would be adopted on a company-to-company basis rather than by individuals. But you could have say an oil-backed currency, not something like petrodollar, but something like this. This promissory slip is, you can hand this in for X, a set value, a set amount of oil.
Okay. And another point to be talked about is, like, when you use gold or silver as money, if you're going to, there is a finite amount in the earth. So if a government is using gold and silver as money, then if the government decides, I want to create more money, you actually have to pay the miners to extract the gold or the silver. You've got to pay the processors to process it and ensure the necessary level of purity. You've got to pay the mint to then mint the coins. And when all is said and done, then you're only going to make more money if the value of that money is greater than the cost of creating it. But when you use fiat currency, it costs the same amount of money to print a $1 bill as it does a $100 bill, and that new money doesn't represent any significant expenditure of resources like the gold or silver does.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why gold and silver are very stable, is because there's no incentive to try and there's no way you can inflate gold and silver without losing money.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are just some of the things that come into it. But the point is, in a free market, if we have a free market where there is no money or currency of any kind, people are just left to barter. They realize very quickly how difficult it is to figure out, how much a glass of milk. I'll trade you a glass of milk for a glass of sweet tea. Is that worthwhile? Maybe to somebody, but not to somebody else. Doing business becomes very difficult if you're just trying to barter as it is. People realize we need some kind of medium of exchange. And when the free market functions, gold and silver always assert themselves as because of their utility for the reasons we've just described. But it's and paper currency does not, for the reasons we've described. That's why governments have to slap legal tender laws down to force you to accept it in businesses. So when you ask the question, who is going to enforce the currency, the answer is currency. In a free market, currency should not be enforced. It's only because of fiat currencies are inherently worthless that the government has to enforce it by law.
Okay, J.C. Armitage brings up the point, what is gold backed by, and brings up the example of the Roman Empire debasing their currency. First up, debasing is fraud. That's straight up fraud, what they did. And to answer your first question, what is gold backed by? I would say gold is backed by the laws of physics. I can't conjure up new gold out of thin air. That violates the law of conservation of mass energy.
And it also say it represents the physical labor of the miners that extracted it from the earth, of the processors who ensured the necessary level of purity, of the minters that actually minted the coins. But when you have pure gold and silver coins that make it onto the market, those coins now represent the physical sweat and time of the people who made it happen. But paper money costs ink and paper. It costs 3.5 cents to print a $1 bill. It costs 3.5 cents to print a $100 bill. That new money doesn't represent any significant expenditure of resources. So it actually represents an amount of the same level of resources that existed in the economy. And when the Roman Empire debased their coin, that's effectively what they were doing. As Pipsqueak said, they were committing fraud by creating currency and then creating more currency, passing it off as gold and silver when it really wasn't. The amount of labor it took to create those debased coins did not accurately represent what it would have taken to create more gold and to extract and create more gold and silver coins.
Yeah, they didn't actually put more gold coins into the economy. They just put gold and copper alloy coins into the economy and called them gold coins. And what happened when people realized that this was what the Roman state was doing is that they started paying their taxes almost exclusively in these alloy coins and used the known pure gold coins in the market, and those gold coins became extremely valuable.
Mm-hmm. And there's actually a story that really, for those that are interested, you should look in. Diocletian, I think, is his name. But there's a Roman emperor who, as the Roman inflation was taking place because of the debasement of their currency, the Roman emperor Diocletian thought he could fix this with economic central planning. So he released something that was called the Edict of Prices, which basically said that businesses were not allowed to raise their prices no matter what. Well, of course, what happened then was that people just closed it, since people realized they couldn't raise their prices to the necessary levels to recover their costs. They just ended up closing their businesses or seeking jobs elsewhere. So Diocletian, great expert that he was, then passed a law saying that every son, basically, no matter what your profession was, your child has to take on that same profession under force of law. And it's one of the things that really threw the Roman economy into the toilet and put it on the slide down to the fall of the Roman Empire. All right. Stream has been going for an hour now. I usually like to end on something not so serious. So if anybody has anything entertainment or, non-current events, political efforts to discuss, now's the time to do it.
Oh, geez.
Gilberto Trinidad, how large condoms will be in an ANCAP society?
Very large.
As large as the demand is for them.
Uh-huh.
Now, on that, there's something to discuss. Who here has seen Trojan commercials on any of the streaming services that they watch?
Not so much anymore.
Okay, recently on Hulu, I think it is, I've been seeing more and more Trojan commercials. And I'm just going to say, from a marketing perspective, they do not make me want to use Trojan condoms.
Yeah, no, right.
Yeah. Now, granted, there aren't really a whole lot of options out there. Trojan seems to have a dominant market share on that issue, but yeah, Trojan Man and the Trojan commercials, not exactly selling it to me.
Exactly.
So if anyone from Trojan is watching, get a new Trojan Man. The one you've got just kind of makes me go,
No.
JC Armitage says, I already posted this, but did you know that the first Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is getting a remake on the Switch? Yes, I actually did see that video was released on the Pokemon official YouTube channel. As big of a Pokemon fan as I am, I never really got into Mystery Dungeon. I've always been on the main series games, but who knows? Maybe I'll check it out. All right. Well, I guess that pretty much brings this stream to an end. Just a couple things coming up for my channel. This week's video is going to be released a day late. I apologize for that, but I had a number of things I had to take care of today, so I'm going to be releasing this week's video on Monday. It is a response to Dave Cullen of Computing Forever on the issue of whether or not the free market is adequately handling the issue of internet censorship. Also, been working on my ANCAP novel. I know I've sent the outline to my patrons, and they sounded like so far I've gotten positive feedback on that. It's going to get posted on Wattpad here shortly. I commissioned at least what I've written of it so far. I commissioned a cover to be made, and as soon as that cover is ready, I will get it put up on Wattpad. So stay tuned for the link. As for that. And other than that, Pipsqueak, Night Shift, thank you for your continued support. And for all those who support my channel financially, if you'd like to get in on these monthly chats or any of the other rewards that come with being a patron, head to Subscribestar, Patreon, or Bitbacker. I've linked all three in this stream. And as always, that is my 2 cents. So take it for what it's worth.